So I want you to picture standing in a freezing, muddy forest in central France. It's the early days of October, the year is 732, and you're looking through the timber at an army approaching from the south.
Right, and it's cold, it's miserable.
Exactly, it's completely miserable. But this isn't just any army you're looking at. This is a military machine that has quite literally never lost a war in 100 years.
Which is just wild to even think about.
It really is. I mean, you are looking at an empire that has swallowed the ancient world whole. They've crushed the Persians. They took Egypt. They erased the entire North African coast, wiped the Visigothic kingdom off the map. And now they're looking at you.
And that image alone, I think, completely upends how we are normally taught to view the Battle of Tours.
Oh, absolutely.
Because we were so conditioned by this traditional, European narrative of a scrappy defense saving Christendom. But standing in those woods, looking at the Umayyad vanguard, the idea of a European victory wouldn't just seem unlikely, it would seem physically impossible.
Yeah, you are facing an opponent who treats winning not as a possibility, but as an absolute certainty.
Right, it's just Tuesday for them.
Exactly, and that certainty is exactly what we are dissecting today in this deep dive. We are taking the centuries-old, mythologized Western narrative of this battle, and we are just shelving it.
Which I love, because it's so necessary for a real historical reconstruction.
Yeah.
We have to set that baggage aside.
We really do. So we are going to reconstruct this clash entirely from the perspective of the Umayyad Caliphate and their commanding general, the governor of Al-Andalus, al-Rahman al-Ghafiqi.
Because we really have to examine what happens to a commander's mind.
Mm-hmm.
His logistical planning, his perception of his enemies when he belongs to a civilization that operates under a full century of relentless, unbroken momentum.
Yeah, and to really grasp that momentum, we have to look at the timeline, because the sheer velocity of the Islamic expansion before this moment, it defies almost every historical precedent.
It really does. I mean, if you go back precisely 100 years to 622 CE.
Right, the Hijra.
Yeah, when the Prophet Muhammad leaves Mecca for Medina, you have the political genesis of this entire movement. And by the time the Prophet dies in 632, the Arabian Peninsula is unified.
Which is fast enough on its own.
Right, but from there, the geographic explosion is just staggering.
Staggering is honestly the only word for it, because by 636, so just 4 years later, Arab armies confront the Sassanid Persian Empire at the Battle of Al-Qadisiyah.
4 years. That's like a single modern presidential term.
Exactly. And the Sassanids weren't some minor regional power either. They were a 400-year-old superpower.
Right, they had cataphracts, war elephants, huge wealth.
Yeah, heavily armored cavalry, massive agricultural resources, the whole works. Yet the Arab armies completely dismantle them. Persia just begins to fall.
I always find myself snagging on that specific detail.
Just so.
Well, how does a coalition of newly unified tribes from the Arabian Peninsula fundamentally break a 400-year-old superpower in a matter of years? Because you often hear it chalked up to, like, purely religious fervor.
Right.
Which just feels like a massive oversimplification of military mechanics,
No, it is a massive oversimplification. I mean, yes, religious unity provided the internal cohesion to prevent the tribes from fracturing, for sure. But the physical mechanics of why they won came down to exhaustion and a massive tactical mismatch.
Exhaustion of the empires they were fighting, right?
Exactly. For the previous 30 years, the Byzantine and Sassanid empires had been fighting this apocalyptic, grinding war against each other.
Basically fighting themselves into the dirt.
Literally. They had drafted their middle classes into the dirt, their treasuries were empty, and the plague of Justinian had just ravaged their demographics. So when the early Caliphate's armies arrived, they are essentially kicking in the doors of a rotten structure.
And you have to add in the specific tactical advantages of the Arab armies, too, because they possessed a mobility that the Sassanids and Byzantines simply could not match.
Oh, yeah. The light cavalry.
Right, in the open, arid terrain of the Middle East, that lighter Arab cavalry could outmaneuver the heavy, cumbersome Sassanid cataphracts all day.
They could strike, retreat into the desert where the heavier armies just couldn't follow because of supply constraints, and then strike again.
It was a form of operational tempo that the ancient empires were just too exhausted to defend against.
And that tempo only accelerates. I mean, 5 years after breaking the Sassanids, they take Egypt from the Byzantine Empire in 641.
It's just huge.
It's massive. Egypt was the breadbasket of the ancient world. It fed Constantinople. Alexandria, which was the intellectual jewel of antiquity, passes into the Umayyad sphere.
Wow.
And then between 670 and 698, they sweep across the entire coast of North Africa, culminating in the fall of Carthage. And then, they look across the water to Europe.
Right, the crossing of the Strait of Gibraltar in 711 CE.
Mm-hmm.
Tariq ibn Ziyad lands in Iberia with a vanguard of perhaps, 7,000 men?
About that, yeah. Just 7,000.
And the Visigothic kingdom of Hispania was this massive entrenched entity. Yet within 2 years, it entirely disintegrates.
2 years.
It becomes Al-Andalus. The timeline here always leaves me completely stunned. I mean, Rome took half a millennium to build the territorial equivalent of what the Caliphate conquered in one single century.
Yeah, and for you, the listener, you really have to make a massive cognitive shift to understand a society processing that level of success.
It becomes a psychological baseline?
Exactly.
Yeah.
For the soldiers in the Umayyad armies, their fathers never lost a war. Their grandfathers never lost a war. The concept of losing a campaign is effectively bred out of the military's psychological DNA.
But the military victory is really only half the equation, right? Because you can't hold territory from Persia all the way to Spain for 100 years just by being good with a sword.
No, you absolutely cannot.
The early caliphate possessed a highly sophisticated administrative apparatus. They didn't just burn cities and leave.
They integrated them. And this is so crucial for understanding Abd al-Rahman's worldview later on. When the Umayyads took a territory, the conquered peoples often found themselves in a tangibly better economic position.
Which is wild to think about from a conquest perspective.
Right. But the Byzantines, for example, they taxed their provinces into abject poverty to fund their endless wars. And they violently persecuted anyone who didn't follow the state's specific brand of Orthodox Christianity.
Whereas the Umayyads instituted the jizya.
Right, the capitation tax.
Yeah, it was a tax levied on non-Muslims in exchange for state protection and, crucially, exemption from military service.
So for a farmer in Egypt or a merchant in Hispania, the arrival of the Umayyad administration meant lower taxes, less corruption, and the freedom to actually practice their religion without being branded a heretic by Constantinople.
The administration was literate, legally structured, and just highly efficient.
Exactly. So by the time we reach 730 CE, when Caliph Hisham appoints Abd al-Rahman al-Ghafiqi as the wali, the governor of Al-Andalus, he is taking control of the jewel of the West.
And we should be clear, Abd al-Rahman is not some barbarian chieftain.
Far from it. Chroniclers describe him as highly intelligent, a meticulous administrator, and just a really seasoned commander.
So he is bringing imperial order to what he perceives as a chaotic, fractured frontier.
Yes. When he looks north across the Pyrenees toward Gaul, he doesn't see a formidable rival civilization. He sees the rotting, decentralized ruins of the old Roman world.
But he also knows the terrain firsthand, right? Because he had actually fought in Gaul a decade earlier.
He had, at the Battle of Toulouse in 721.
And Toulouse is such a fascinating precursor to Tours. Because in 721, Duke Hughes of Aquitaine, who was also known as Odo the Great, he surprised an Umayyad force that was besieging the city.
Right. The Umayyads were mostly light infantry then, and they were caught entirely unawares.
And Ujis just slaughtered them.
He did. But Abd al-Rahman survived the disaster, took command of the retreating forces, and actually managed to lead the survivors back south.
So he carries the memory of that specific tactical failure with him. He knows Hughes of Aquitaine.
Intimately.
But knowing Abd al-Rahman was this efficient, calculating administrator, the invasion of Gaul in 732 couldn't have just been like a random desire for revenge.
No, not at all.
There had to be a geopolitical trigger that forced his hand.
There was, and it was a direct threat to his border security. So Duke Eudes, feeling squeezed between the expanding power of the Franks to his north and the Umayyad presence to his south, tried to engineer a buffer state.
Oh, right. The alliance with Munusa.
Exactly. He allied himself with Uthman ibn Naisa, a Berber lord who served as the Umayyad deputy governor of Catalonia.
The Franks called him Munusa, right?
Yes, Munusa. And he was currently in open rebellion against the central authority in Cordoba. Eudes even married his daughter, Lampagi, to this rebel governor to cement the alliance.
Which is just a staggering provocation.
It really is.
I mean, a Christian duke is actively propping up a rebellious Muslim governor to destabilize the Umayyad frontier. For Abd al-Rahman, newly appointed and charged with maintaining imperial order, a rebellion on his border supported by a foreign duke is an existential threat to his authority.
And he responds with terrifying speed. In 731, Abd al-Rahman marches into Catalonia and completely crushes the rebellion. Uthman is killed.
Boom, rebellion over.
But having secured the immediate border, Abd al-Rahman realizes the root of the problem is still sitting up in Aquitaine. Duke Eudes had actively sponsored treason.
So from the Umayyad perspective, Eudes had just voided his own right to rule.
Completely voided it. It necessitates the erasure of the Duchy of Aquitaine from the map. So Abd al-Rahman calls for a massive mobilization. He assembles a vast army in Pamplona.
And this wasn't just a local force, right? He's pulling from all over.
Oh, everywhere. Drawing elite cavalry recruits from across the empire, men from Yemen, the Levant, Arabia, North Africa.
So when they cross the Pyrenees in the spring of 732, this is not a localized raiding party.
Not at all. This is a highly disciplined, mobilized, heavy cavalry force with extensive logistical trains.
And when they finally cornered Duke Eudes at the Battle of the River Garonne, just outside Bordeaux, the outcome is fundamentally different from Toulouse.
Very different. Eudes makes a catastrophic error. At Toulouse, he had the element of surprise against light infantry. At the Garonne, he is forced to meet mobilized Arab heavy cavalry in an open field battle.
And let's break down the mechanics of that, because the word cavalry can mean many things to people listening.
Yeah, it's a broad term.
Right, so why does an 8th century infantry force get utterly dismantled by heavy cavalry in an open field?
It really comes down to kinetic energy and psychological terror.
The physics of it.
Exactly. The Aquitanian infantry were largely levies. We're talking farmers and local militias with spears and wooden shields. In an open field, heavy cavalry has a space to build up maximum speed.
Right, they could just charge.
Yeah, and when hundreds of armored horses hit a loose infantry line at a full gallop, the physical impact just shatters the formation. Once an infantry line breaks and men start running, the cavalry can simply ride them down from behind.
It's a massacre.
It is. The chroniclers writing about the Garonne state, God alone knows the number of the slain. Eudes' army doesn't just retreat, it ceases to exist.
Wow. So the destruction is absolute.
Absolute. Abd al-Rahman sacks Bordeaux, secures an immense amount of plunder, and leaves southern Gaul in smoking ruins.
And this victory, I imagine, creates a profound confirmation bias in Abd al-Rahman's mind.
Oh, undoubtedly. He had just annihilated the sovereign power of the region in a single afternoon. It reinforced his belief that the lands beyond the Pyrenees were soft.
Because to him, the local armies were undisciplined, the political structures were fragmented.
Exactly. He assumed Eudes was the ultimate authority in the region, so by crushing him, the primary defense of Gaul was gone.
This wasn't an invasion behind enemy lines anymore for him. It was simply the administrative absorption of a new province.
But his assessment of the political landscape was fatally flawed. Eudes wasn't the apex predator of Gaul. He was just a buffer. And having removed that buffer, Abd al-Rahman makes a highly specific directional choice. Instead of turning back south with his plunder, he points his army north, toward the river Loire.
Headed straight for the city of Tours.
Yes, and specifically, the Abbey of St. Martin of Tours.
Now, targeting a monastery sounds like a side quest for plunder. Like, why bother? But we really have to understand the political economy of 8th century Europe here.
It's so different from today.
It is. Monasteries were essentially the central banks of the era. St. Martin of Tours was the holiest, most prestigious shrine in Western Europe. It was bursting with centuries of gold, silver, and offerings deposited by nobles for safekeeping.
But beyond the physical wealth, marching an imperial army to the steps of St. Martin was a massive geopolitical statement.
It was a declaration of absolute spiritual and physical dominance. By taking St. Martin, Abd al-Rahman would be broadcasting to every noble in Gaul, like, your most sacred shrines cannot protect you, your wealth belongs to the Caliphate, and your lands are now our frontier.
That's exactly the message. But the destruction of Eudes' army forces the Duke into a desperate corner. The broken, humiliated Eudes has absolutely no military assets left.
So he has to swallow his pride.
He does. His only option is to flee north and beg for intervention from his greatest political rival. And this introduces the variable that Abd al-Rahman fundamentally failed to account for.
Because Eudes rides north to beg for the help of Charles Martel.
Right.
And from the Umayyad perspective, this must have just looked like one defeated barbarian lord running to another disorganized barbarian lord for help.
They had no idea.
They had no clue that Charles Martel was essentially a hardened professional warlord.
Not a clue. Charles was the mayor of the Palace of Austrasia.
Which, I have to say, mayor of the palace sounds like an administrative desk job.
It really does.
It sounds like he manages the king's schedule or plans banquets.
Right, but the Merovingian kings at this time were completely powerless figureheads. Charles was the de facto ruler of the Franks. He had spent the last decade brutally consolidating power, fighting grinding wars against the Saxons, the Frisians, and the Alemanni.
He had built something incredibly rare for that period in Europe, which is a battle-hardened professional veteran corps of infantry.
Yes, his men were bound to him by years of shared campaigning and the spoils of victory. So when Charles receives word that this Umayyad juggernaut is moving north toward Tours, his response dictates the entire strategic flow of the coming battle.
He forces a march south, with an army estimated at around 30,000 men.
Austrasians, Neustrians, Germans, Bavarians. But the way he moves them is what sets up the trap. He avoids the old Roman roads.
Which is wild. Moving 30,000 men and their supplies through the dense forests and hills of central France, avoiding main roads, is a logistical nightmare.
It's insane.
But Charles does it because he knows two things. He must maintain the element of surprise, and under no circumstances can he allow his infantry to meet the Arab cavalry on an open plain like Udes did.
And this exposes a staggering intelligence failure on the part of the Umayyads. Abd al-Rahman had no idea Charles was even there. He was operating completely blind in hostile territory.
The failure to scout adequately is really the fatal flaw of the entire campaign.
Absolutely.
The Umayyad vanguard was severely bogged down by immense trains of wagons carrying the plunder from Bordeaux. They were moving at a crawl.
Because Abd al-Rahman assumed the Franks were just another disorganized militia. He allowed his army's operational speed to drop to zero, handing the strategic initiative entirely to Charles.
It's like watching a chess player who is so focused on capturing a knight being Udes and collecting a few pawns along the way that they completely fail to realize they have maneuvered their queen directly into the path of a hidden rook.
That is the perfect analogy. Charles Martel chose the time, he chose the place, and he parked 30,000 veterans directly across the Umayyad line of advance.
Which brings us to the terrain itself.
Yes.
It's October 732. The Umayyad vanguard is pushing north toward Tours, and suddenly they find the road blocked by a wall of Frankish shields. Charles has positioned his army on a high, wooded plain situated between the Claine and Vienne rivers.
The geography of that position is a masterpiece of defensive planning. By placing his army on an incline, surrounded by dense timber, Charles dictates the physics of the engagement.
He fundamentally neutralizes the Umayyad cavalry's primary weapon, which is momentum.
Exactly.
A heavy cavalry charge requires open ground to build up speed to shatter an infantry line. If the horses have to pick their way uphill through dense trees, they hit the infantry line at a trot, completely robbing them of their kinetic energy.
But the battle doesn't start immediately. There is a psychological standoff that lasts for 7 full days.
7 days of staring at each other across the timberline with only minor skirmishes.
Abd al-Rahman is forced to wait because his army is strung out. He needs his full, sprawling force in those slow-moving baggage trains to catch up and assemble.
And Charles, on the other hand, is perfectly content to wait.
Oh yeah, every passing day brings them deeper into October.
And the weather becomes a weapon.
It really does.
The temperature in central France in late autumn is bitter. The Mozarabic Chronicle, which is a vital contemporary source for this, notes the stark difference in preparation. The Franks are wearing heavy woolen cloaks and furs, totally accustomed to the freezing conditions. But the Umayyad troops, drawn heavily from North Africa, Yemen, and the Levant, are equipped in lighter gear, suitable for much warmer climates. The longer they sit, the more the cold sapped the strength of the Umayyad forces.
And let's examine the formation Charles uses here, because the Franks at this time are fighting almost entirely on foot. You might ask, why didn't Charles just meet them with his own heavy cavalry?
Well, the Franks did not heavily utilize the stirrup at this point in history.
Right, the stirrup is everything.
It is. The physics of the stirrup are the defining factor of heavy cavalry. Without a stirrup, if a rider hits a target with a lance at a full gallop, the kinetic feedback will simply push the rider backward right off the horse.
You just go flying off the back.
Exactly. The stirrup allows the rider to lock their feet in, transferring the force of the impact through their legs into the saddle and into the immense mass of the horse itself. Because the Franks lacked this technology in widespread use, they could not field effective shock cavalry. They were forced to fight as heavy infantry.
So Charles deploys his 30,000 men into a massive, dense infantry square, basically a phalanx. The chronicles describe them holding together like a glacier in the cold regions.
Wow.
They are standing shoulder to shoulder, their large wooden shields locked together, bristling with spear points.
And when Abd al-Rahman finally realizes he cannot wait any longer and gives the order to attack on October 10th What follows is a day of sheer, unfathomable physical endurance.
Yeah.
The Umayyad heavy cavalry charges the Frankish square, and then they wheel around, regroup, and charge it again.
Just imagine the sensory horror of that experience for the Frankish infantry. The ground shaking, the terrifying sound of thousands of armored horses screaming through the trees, crashing into the shield wall, the sheer muscle fatigue of holding a heavy wooden shield in place, while 1,000 pounds of horse and rider slam into it hour after hour.
Because for a disciplined infantry formation to withstand the repeated shock of heavy cavalry was considered almost impossible in the military doctrine of the era.
It just wasn't done.
The natural human instinct when a horse charges at you is to turn and run.
Of course.
But if one man runs, a gap opens, the cavalry exploits it, and the entire formation shatters.
And the Arab chronicles actually admit that their cavalry did break into the Frankish square several times during the day.
They penetrated the shield wall, they created gaps, but instead of panicking, the veteran discipline of Charles's men took over.
They didn't break.
No. The line simply closed ranks around the intruding cavalry, trapping them inside the square, and hacked them down. They just kept stabbing, stepping over the dead, and holding the line.
It's brutal. So late in the afternoon, the battle is locked in this bloody stalemate. But then a psychological shift occurs, entirely driven by a failure of communication. A rumor spreads through the Umayyad ranks.
And the rumor is that Frankish scouts have bypassed the main engagement and are currently raiding the Umayyad encampment in the rear.
Let's unpack the reality of that camp, because it wasn't just a military supply dump with spare arrows and grain.
No, not at all. The camp contained the immense, staggering wealth they had plundered from Bordeaux and the rest of Aquitaine. But even more crucially, many of the soldiers were accompanied by their families, their wives, concubines, and children.
Which, bringing your family into a war zone deep in hostile territory seems strategically insane to a modern observer.
It seems completely insane until you remember the psychological baseline we established earlier.
Right.
They did not view this as a dangerous raid behind enemy lines. They viewed it as a moving settlement. They possessed absolute certainty that Gaul was already theirs, just another province waiting to be administered. The camp was the physical manifestation of their hubris.
So, in the chaos of an 8th century battlefield where there are no radios, no clear lines of sight through the smoke and the trees, only shouting and flags, the rumor that the camp is being sacked hits the cavalry formations.
And a massive contingent of Muslim cavalry suddenly breaks off from the frontline attack. They turn their horses around and rush back toward the camp to protect their families and their loot.
But to the rest of the Umayyad army, who cannot see the camp and don't know the specifics of the rumor, this sudden mass movement toward the rear looks like one thing.
It looks like a rout.
Yes.
It looks like the army is breaking.
Yeah.
And panic is highly contagious. When you see a large portion of your elite cavalry abandoning the fight and riding away, fear takes over. The momentum stalls, the line begins to dissolve, and the retreat cascades into chaos.
Put yourself in al-Rahman's position in that exact moment. For his entire life, his civilization's military machine has been invincible. And now he is watching his army dissolve right in front of him.
Yeah.
Not because they are being outfought by the Franks, but because they are distracted by the spoils of their own previous victories.
It is the ultimate tragic irony. The riches of their success are destroying their discipline.
Exactly.
Al-Rahman sees the collapse happening, and he does what any brave, competent commander would do in an attempt to salvage the situation. He rides forward directly into the chaos, trying to rally his panicked men, trying to turn them back toward the Frankish line.
But in doing so, he exposes himself. He pushes too far forward, gets surrounded by Frankish infantry, and a spear or a sword finds its mark. He is struck in the chest, and the governor of Al-Andalus falls dead in the mud.
The loss of the commander is the final blow. The Umayyad army pulls back to their camp as night falls, leaving the Franks holding the hill.
Abd al-Rahman is dead, but the physical reality of the situation is that the Umayyad army is still massive.
Very much so.
They still possess thousands of elite cavalry. They are heavily armed. So why didn't they simply regroup in the camp, elect a new commander, and crush the exhausted Franks the next morning?
That question reveals the fundamental difference in tactical innovation and psychological motivation between the two armies.
Break that down for us.
Well, tactically, Charles Martel's strict reliance on a disciplined, static infantry formation in favorable terrain completely neutralized the Umayyad advantage. But psychologically, the motivations of the common soldier were entirely different.
The Franks were fighting for survival.
Exactly. They were standing in the freezing cold, defending their specific homes, their families, who lived just a few days' march to the north. They had absolutely nowhere to retreat to, If the line breaks, everything they know burns.
Whereas the Umayyads were thousands of miles from home.
They were attacking an abstract objective for distant imperial glory. And more importantly, they were weighed down by immediate physical plunder. Once they had the gold of Aquitaine in their tents, their primary motivation shifted from conquest to survival. They wanted to live to enjoy the loot.
So when Abd al-Rahman dies, the entire connective tissue of the Umayyad army severs. The anatomy of their retreat is just a masterclass in coalition fragility.
The Umayyad army was not a monolith, right? It was a highly fragile alliance of varied nationalities, ethnicities, and tribal affiliations. You had Arabs, Berbers, Yemenis, Levantines. The only things holding this disparate group together were the unstoppable momentum of victory and the personal, charismatic authority of Abd al-Rahman.
And by the evening of October 10th, both the momentum and the commander are gone.
Right. The moment the camp settles into the night, the squabbling begins. The surviving generals convene to elect a new commander, and the racial and ethnic fault lines violently crack open.
They just start fighting each other.
Instantly. The Berbers refuse to take orders from the Yemenis. The Arabs refuse to submit to a Berber commander. Because they have been stripped of the concept of losing for a century, they have absolutely no institutional resilience for managing a power vacuum during a stalemate.
They are psychologically incapable of processing the setback. So as night falls, the Franks remain on the hill. They sleep on their weapons in the freezing cold, surrounded by thousands of dead bodies, fully expecting the massive Arab cavalry to resume the assault at dawn.
It must have been a terrifying night.
Unbelievably tense, but when the sun rises on October 11th, the battlefield is terrifyingly quiet.
The Franks look down the hill and see the countless tents of the Umayyad camp still erected, stretching across the horizon. Charles Martel, who is a deeply cautious and experienced commander, immediately suspects a trap.
He's not going to just charge down there.
No. He assumes the Umayyads are hiding inside the tents, waiting for the Frankish infantry to break formation and rush down to loot the camp, at which point the cavalry will ambush them in the open.
So Charles orders his men to hold the line. They stand there for hours, freezing, waiting for an attack that never comes. Finally, he sends a few scouts forward to reconnoiter the camp.
And the scouts creep into the camp and find it completely abandoned.
Just empty tents.
Because the Umayyad generals couldn't agree on a commander, and because their primary goal had shifted to securing the immense wealth they had already plundered, they ordered a completely silent, rapid withdrawal under the cover of darkness. They left their tents standing to deceive the Franks, packed whatever loot they could carry, and slipped away southward, racing back toward the Pyrenees.
The relief on that hill must have been profound. But Charles doesn't mount a massive pursuit, does he?
He doesn't. He secures the abandoned Umayyad camp, takes the considerable plunder they left behind, and carefully manages his army. He knows his heavy infantry cannot outrun light cavalry in a pursuit, and he knows he has achieved his strategic objective.
The Umayyad advance is permanently broken.
Exactly.
The aftermath of that silent morning reshapes the political architecture of the world. Charles Martel uses the immense prestige of this victory to further consolidate his absolute power over the Franks.
He is never officially crowned king, but he secures Frankish dominance over Western Europe.
Yeah. His son, Pepin the Short, will eventually depose the last Merovingian figurehead and become the actual king of the Franks, eventually driving the remaining Muslim garrisons out of Narbonne in 759.
And Charles's grandson, Charlemagne, will unite most of Western Europe and be crowned Emperor of the West by the Pope in the year 800.
Without the victory at Tours, Charles doesn't have the political capital to build that dynasty. The Carolingian Empire, which lays the foundational borders of modern France and Germany, doesn't exist. But what happens south of the Pyrenees? Does the defeat at Tours trigger the collapse of Al-Andalus?
Not at all. And this is vital to understanding the Umayyad perspective. To them, the death of Abd al-Rahman was a painful, disastrous setback on the frontier, but it was not an apocalyptic end to their world.
Right.
Despite the defeat, Al-Andalus thrives for another 760 years.
They simply pivot. The immense cultural, economic, and intellectual energy that had been focused on endless territorial expansion is turned inward.
They build a golden age in Iberia. Al-Andalus becomes arguably the most sophisticated civilization in Western Europe. Centuries later, while European monks are huddled in freezing monasteries copying manuscripts by candlelight, the Great Library of Cordoba will hold 400,000 volumes.
It's incredible.
They develop paved streets, streetlights, advanced medicine, and running water. The Islamic presence in Iberia remains a dominant cultural and political force until the completion of the Reconquista in 1492.
That reality feeds directly into the great historical debate about Tours. Did the battle actually save Europe? For centuries, historians like Edward Gibbon championed the idea that if Charles had lost, the Umayyads would have marched all the way to Scotland, and the Quran would be taught at Oxford.
Right, the grand sweeping narrative.
Yeah. But modern historiography takes a much more nuanced view.
Modern historians, like Khalid Yahya Blankenship, argue that the Umayyad Caliphate was already suffering from massive imperial overextension by 732.
They were stretched too thin.
Exactly. They point out that the empire was about to be torn apart by severe internal tensions. Just 8 years after Tours, the Great Berber Revolt breaks out in North Africa in 740, severely crippling the Umayyad military apparatus.
And shortly after that, the Abbasid Revolution topples the Umayyad dynasty entirely at the Battle of the Zab.
So from this macroeconomic view, the advance into Gaul was doomed to stall eventually due to internal collapse, regardless of what happened at Tours.
So we have to acknowledge that the Carolingians actively used the victory at Tours as propaganda. They elevated Charles Martel to a mythic status to justify their usurpation of the Frankish crown.
It was the perfect narrative tool.
It really was, legitimizing their dynasty as the saviors of a unified West standing against the East.
They absolutely did. But we shouldn't let the propaganda entirely erase the tactical reality. Even if Tours was, in the grand scheme of the Caliphate, just a large-scale raid gone wrong, its symbolic and political weight in Europe was massive.
Truly massive.
He established the physical and political space for the Carolingian Empire to exist. Without Charles Martel holding that hill, the political evolution of Europe looks fundamentally different.
And while historians can debate the macro-level impact of overextended empires and internal revolts, the micro-level reality for the men on the ground is absolute. For Abd al-Rahman al-Ghafiqi, the result was definitively apocalyptic. He was a brilliant administrator and a brave commander who was undone by his own failure to scout, by the burden of his own army's plunder, and by a sudden, fatal failure to recognize the unique discipline of his opponent until a spear found his chest.
He died watching the edge of an empire that had expanded continuously for a century finally turn into an unyielding wall.
We have spent this time tracing a localized law of physics, a century of relentless momentum that carried the armies of a new faith from the sands of Arabia, across the ancient empires of Persia and Byzantium, sweeping through North Africa, leaping across the Strait of Gibraltar, and marching straight into the deep, freezing forests of central France.
And we have seen how that automatic certainty of victory culminated in a bloody halt on a cold October day against a wall of Frankish shields.
We've stripped away the myth of miraculous salvation and looked at the gritty mechanics of military systems, logistics, and psychology. We saw how the lack of a stirrup shaped Frankish tactics, how the freezing weather sapped Umayyad strength, and how the fragility of an untested coalition proved fatal against a unified, highly motivated defending force.
Which leaves you, the listener, with one final lingering question to turn over in your mind. The historical evidence proves that the Umayyad army that fled silently in the night was still incredibly dangerous.
Very dangerous.
They were heavily armed, they still possessed tens of thousands of elite cavalry, and they were entirely capable of waging war. What if Abd al-Rahman had not ridden forward into the chaos of that retreating cavalry?
What if he had stayed back and that single spear had missed him?
What if he had survived the day to enforce order and discipline on his bickering generals in the camp that night? Could a disciplined Umayyad withdrawal have turned into a renewed, coordinated offensive a week later?
The entire cultural and political framework of modern Europe, everything from the Carolingian Renaissance to the borders we recognize today, may very well hinge on a single anonymous weapon strike that found the chest of a governor who, right up until the very end, simply believed he was fighting just another battle.